Hello and welcome back. This is lecture 4 of the Dark Knight Rises lecture series. And, if you haven't seen lecture 1 and you're watching on YouTube, go up above. But if you have seen, you know we're at a good point. And things are going, things aren't going great overall, but they're hopeful. And that's one of the most interesting points of this entire movie. So, one question that I think one might ask, and I think this is a reasonable question, is, okay, so you're Batman. You were just betrayed by the girl in which you completely trusted, right? You were just betrayed by Catwoman and Hathaway's character, right? You were just completely broken, right? Literally broken back, broken spirit, broken soul, all that stuff. And then at the same time, you're thrown into this pit where you could easily just lie down and die. And the question is, why even try to get out? Right? Why even try to get out? That's a legitimate question, because then it leads you to the more broader question of, why be a good person? Right? Why do we make this judgment as people? Why do we say it is important to be a good person? It is important to do things that are beneficial to others, instead of something like naked self-interest. Because you think of someone like, pick anybody, right? Jeffrey Epstein, Joseph Stalin, pick any successful but also completely screwed up type of person, and you could say they lived a pretty decent life, right? It would be an almost, it's an unfortunate reality of life that Joseph Stalin lived to 82 and was able to live in luxury, get all the food, sex, and pleasure that he possibly ever wanted. Elvis, same thing, right? Elvis literally died by, overdosing on as many drugs as he was possibly able to take, the best drugs possible. And, you look at something like that and you say, they were sort of stuck in this. No, not that. You could say that they were kind of, acting purely on this naked self-interest. They didn't really care about other people. They didn't really care about what was good for society. They just never made that decision to be a good person. And you could make the reasonable case that they never paid for it. That they just lived a good life and then died. Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, all those, awful people who contributed, I think, combined to, 80 million deaths. Those two people lived until they were well within their 80s and died of natural causes. And, you got to ask the question, right? This begs the question, why be a good person? Why do we make this value judgment? Why do we say that it's important? And, the first thing to recognize is it's an arbitrary decision. This is an arbitrary decision. To make this leap, I'll get Batman doing it. To make this leap is one of the most arbitrary decisions that you're going to make in your entire life. And, I'm a firm believer, first of all, that not everybody makes this decision, right? Not everybody makes this decision. And I think this is the crux of the Dark Knight trilogy. This is the crux, because when you get really into it, what is the fundamental story of the Dark Knight? Harvey Dent, right? Harvey Dent is somebody who was faced with the same scenarios. He was faced with the same difficulties of life. Not only was he, we're not going to say betrayed by his potential mate like Batman was, but his mate died, and then he burns off half of his face. He burns off his entire personality, his entire persona. He loses everything by the arbitrary judgments of life. And he chooses not to. He chooses not to be a good person. And it would be naive to not understand why he did it. It would be incredibly naive to just say, well, he just should be a good person. And there's no reason as to why he was a bad person. It's like, no, there are thousands of reasons not to be a good person. It's actually miraculous that we choose to be a good person. It's not miraculous that we choose to be a bad person. That's sort of the same idea as if it were not for if it were not for the leaping and twinkling of the soul, man would decay, man would rot away in his greatest passion, idleness. It's like when you really look at the way that humans are structured, the default position is something like, well, this is the default position. Sitting on your couch doing nothing, and then blaming the world because you never got what you want. And then what happens is then maybe you take some sort of retributory action against that, and well, you decide not to be a good person. Maybe we could say that's the default because, well, I don't think there's any other reason to believe otherwise. I think you look at any 30, 40, 50, 60 resentful, we'll say the archetype is the resentful old man. That's the default position that they chose. And it seems like the answer lies in making a conscious choice to go out of that. Right? Because if something's the default position, then by definition, you have to make the conscious choice to go out of that. And that is summarized perfectly in this idea of a leap of faith. Right? You have to get out of this pit, what do you need to do? You don't just step out. You leap out. You make this arbitrary, fundamental choice that you are going to be a good person. And in Batman's case, you are going to trust. You are going to trust the world and be vulnerable. And there's no logical reason as to why Batman should do this. There's no logical reason as to why you should do this. It's like life sucks and life hits hard, but you got to go with it anyways. You just got to roll with the punches, and that logic is flawed, right? That logic is completely flawed because you could just take the opposite position, just say life sucks, life is awful, life is arbitrarily difficult, like the Joker, like Bane, like these characters that are going to cause misery and hell. So I'm just going to destroy everything. I'm just going to become resentful, and I'm just going to, well, say that life doesn't really mean anything. And that's one of the spirits that Batman has to fight against. He's got to fight against this nihilism. And, well, that's why it requires this sort of leap of faith without the rope. It requires this arbitrary judgment that, well, puts you out on a limb. Right? It puts you out on a limb because when you decide, in Batman's case, and this is really tying it all together, when you decide to trust the world, when you decide to, well, that's a good understanding, right? When you decide to trust the world, that's what you do in every single relationship. You decide to trust that person with your, let's say, life is a strong word, to trust them with your interests, right? Because when you decide to have a friend, they're fulfilling your need to be a friend. And, well, you got to trust them, right? You need to trust them, and if you don't trust them, then they're not your friend. But you need that little leap of faith. And the question is, to make this little leap of faith, what do you need to do? And the answer is something like you need to make a ridiculously arbitrary judgment that people are inherently good and that, no, not that people are inherently good, but that life is something worth trusting and it's worth living. And, well, that's not an easy thing. That's not an easy thing. And we'll see how that actually plays out in The Dark Knight Rises. So what happens is, The Dark Knight Rises, right? Batman comes back, and he comes back into the city. And what does he do? He says to the anima figure. He says to Catwoman, to Anne Hathaway, he says, but I still think there's more to you. He trusts her even more. He doubles down. And, well, if you're asking, is it arbitrary? The answer is yes. It is incredibly arbitrary. And, well, here's the fundamental archetype here. And I think this is the reason why we look so highly upon heroes. First of all, let's take the logical assumption that the default is idleness and the default is not being a hero. Let's say that. And you must consciously choose to be a hero. Let's start with that. Then we must take this idea that for whatever reason, and this is a tough, let's say, leap of faith to make, that the world, because the world is so difficult and tough and flawed, the only way that you could do anything to overcome that is to be more good than the bad of the world. Right? So let's say the world is at a 10 out of 10. You must become an 11 out of 10. Something like that. And that's, well, summarized by the idea of Jesus on the cross. Right? What does Jesus do when he's on the cross? He takes all the fundamental suffering of the world and puts it upon himself. And the idea there is, it's such an arbitrary idea. It's such a leap of faith idea. But the idea is that the archetypal hero, which would be Jesus Christ, the archetypal hero is strong enough to overcome the bad of the world, to overcome the suffering of all of humanity, and still remain good. And that's just a leap of faith. Like, that's just a leap of faith that all of us make in our daily lives, which is just completely arbitrary. And this is exactly what Batman does here. What he does here is he says to his anima, essentially, he says to this girl, I don't care how many times you destroy me. I don't care how many times you betray my trust. I'm still going to trust you. That's it. It's an arbitrary judgment. It's illogical. It's completely illogical, but it's somewhat genius. It's genius because that's what you have to do. That's what the heroes do, and it relies on this completely flawed idea, completely illogical but beautiful idea that you are stronger than whatever the world throws at you, or you could become stronger than what the world throws at you, because Jesus is the archetypal hero. He's the strongest of the strong, and the idea is, and same for Batman relatively, and the idea is very simple. It's like, you can handle it. You can handle it. No matter what life throws at you, you can handle it. And I think that's one of the most positive messages that you could take from any sort of, well, anything. And but at the same time, it's the fact that it's that positive offers some sort of problems in that it's like, how is that? It's a completely naive judgment. It's completely naive. So let's look at how someone else could take this. Actually, no, we don't have to do this. Actually, no, this is good. So this is good. So I'll take you through Star Wars and Anakin Skywalker, and we talked about Anakin earlier in the movie, and obviously he's got the scar on the side of his face, right? You could see that, and let's look at how he could have handled it, right? How he handled it and how he handled it wrong, and you could say resentment, right? Like someone like Harvey Dent just becomes resentful, and obviously we got a lot deeper into that. Something like losing your individuality, something like losing your, well, deciding to take control of yourself. And that's exactly what Anakin does, actually. So maybe they're similar characters. I think they're actually very similar characters. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm doing a Star Wars lecture soon, so I think that's going to be really cool. But the idea here is that Anakin, right, we talked about this before, he has this vision of his mother dying, and he says, and then his mother dies, and then he has this vision of his wife dying, and he says, I won't let this one become real, right? What he's doing here is he's saying, I am going to take complete control. I'm not going to take this leap of faith. I'm not going to, let's say, put my trust in something that exists beyond me. I'm just going to take complete control over this and say this is all my doing. And then he becomes Darth Vader. And you could see how he becomes Darth Vader. So the next thing that happens is you have something like the villain, right, Palpatine, who represents something like security. Well, first of all, he's like he's like the devil, right? He's like the devil incarnate, but he's also the representation of something like security, something like empty promises, and something like dependency. And Anakin says, I need him, right? I need this sort of security. I need to cling on to whatever, whatever control I have left. Because that's what he's doing. He's saying, I need control. I need to be able to control, in this case, my relationship, right? I need to be able to control my... I don't want to get too into it. Just control my relationship. And, well, what does that lead to? Right? That leads to him turning to the dark side. And we could, now armed with this information, you could say, what is the connection between him wanting to take control over his relationship and turning to the dark side? And we could see now, right? It needs some sort of leap of faith. You need something like trust, because whenever you decide to let go of this arbitrary belief in trust, then you lose the relationship itself. You lose the foundation for the relationship itself. And God, that's such a crazy idea, but that's the fundamental belief that our relationships are built on. That exact idea. So, getting back to the previous lecture, the idea is be naked, right? Like, like be naked, right? Maybe not in a sexual metaphor, yes, right? Like why are you only naked with your intimate partner that you are most intimate with and you are most emotionally bonded with? It's like there's a strong correlation there. It's like you're giving all your vulnerability, all your trust to that one person, because when you decide to take off your clothes in front of them, what you're also deciding is, I'm going to give them my trust. I'm going to give them my trust with my naked, vulnerable body. And it's also a relationship metaphor, right? The relationship metaphor is, I am going to give them my emotional trust. I'm going to be emotionally naked with somebody. I'm going to go on the limb with them. And, if you tear apart that, then you become something like Darth Vader. Something like, what is Darth Vader the representation of? He's a machine, right? He is no individuality, right? Same for Harvey Dent. No individuality, and he's completely inhumane. And there's a quote, he's more machine than man. And that's the idea, right? You lose this fundamental idea of trust. You lose this fundamental leap of faith. And, you lose life itself. You lose humanity. You lose relationships. And, that's why sometimes it requires a risk. Everything requires a risk. And, that's just a powerful idea. So that's what Batman does. Batman decides to take the risk. And he says, she... I think it's really funny. She never gives him any belief to believe otherwise, right? She says, I'm leaving, right? He gives her the everything that she's ever wanted, right? This is the archetypal idea. So he gives her the clean slate. He says you could leave, and then he also gives her the bike, right, which gives her an opportunity to leave the city. So her options are very simple. I could option A, I could take my clean slate, pursue my naked self-interest, right, and leave the city, right? There's a bomb about to go off, so I'm going to leave the city. I'm going to save myself, and let all the other meaningless, purposeless humans die. Because why do I care about them if I'm pursuing my own self-interest, right? Why would I need to care about them? They're not me. Why would I risk myself for them? That's a nihilistic belief. And then path B is something like be a hero, right? Something like see that there's more to life than the naked self-interest that presents itself. So something like be a human too. And this is a strong idea that you see in I've seen this archetype way too many times, and I think this is something that people will be able to relate to, right? It's a relatable idea because we are so self-interested as a culture. And I'll just give you the characters right here. You have Han Solo, Star Wars 4. You have this is Professor Snape from the Harry Potter series. You have Maui, right? Maui from Moana. You have Lightning McQueen from Cars. And you have Logan from the movie Logan. That's Wolverine. And all of these characters have one thing in common, and it's that they are pursuers of naked self-interest. Whatever they care about, whatever they believe to be best for them, they're going to pursue it. And, well, they overcome it by the end, right? They overcome this idea of naked self-interest because something like they understand that there's humanity beyond naked self-interest. Self-interest itself is, well, that's a good way of looking at it. Self-interest itself is unhuman because it discounts the fact that every single human is connected in some sort of way. The fact that relationships are what make life real. And that's something that could be proven. Well, I think it has been proven experimentally, but it's like, is that really how we're gonna try to prove it? Is that really how we're gonna try to prove it? I mean, one of the things that you've noticed in your own life, it's like anytime you get into an intimate relationship, that automatically makes life real. There is no doubt about that. Love is what makes life real. Friendships, a good friendship, a good partner, something like a good community to really immerse yourself in. That's what makes life real. And, well, if you just pursue whatever your naked self-interest is, then it's almost as if you're on an island and, well, it's almost as if you I could say maybe it's almost as if you're an animal, because it's like, well, what do you end up doing? You end up just following your own pleasurable self-impulses, and that's really about it. So that's really the archetype right there, right? And the question is, all of these characters, they have to sort of overcome something, right? So in the case of Logan, for example, he's got to overcome his nihilism, right? He's incredibly nihilistic. You got to ask the question, I think this is really more important, why are they self-interested characters? And I think all of them have a different one. You have Logan is incredibly nihilistic, right? He says, hey, listen, life isn't worth living. I'd rather just drink, and what's the point, right? Really, what's the point? And he's actually a good representation of this. If you want to watch the movie Logan, I thought they did a really good job at explaining, like, what someone is like when they don't care about, well, first of all, people, and also just don't have any responsibilities. Then you have someone like, let's see, you have Han Solo, who's the representation of doubt, right? He's like, okay, well, he never took the leap of faith, right? Which he ends up doing. But it's like, why do I even Jedis, like spirit, like what is this? I don't really care about this. Relationships, love. It's like I'd rather just swindle a bunch of different, swindle a bunch of, in his case, debt collectors. And you see the same thing, right? It goes kind of it goes across. You could sort of figure it as you dissect each of the characters, and so that's exactly what Anne Hathaway's character must do, right? What must she overcome? I think that's the most important question. She must overcome something like, well, nihilism, right? Nihilism is probably a good thing because that's the thing that she was telling Bruce Wayne before. She was saying, there's a storm coming, Mr. Wayne, and, well, to each his own. To each his own. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you think. It's whatever arbitrary values I decide to set in place. And so that's what she decides to overcome. So what she has here is she has her way out. Right? Right there is her path out, and she can just take it. And, well, it's her choice, right? It's her choice. Path A, right? Path A is leave and embrace this sense of nihilism. It's not really worth living. It's not worth trusting. Humanity sucks, essentially. And that's sort of we'll say the far range representation of it. You could kind of bring it back to reality by saying something like, well, why should I tell my secrets? Why should I tell my fundamental flaws to anybody? Why should I open myself up to anybody? Because, well, something like they're going, there's a fundamental problem is that they're going to, well, destroy me, right? They're going to destroy me. And no matter what, any good that I do, any positive that I do is not really going to make any impact anyways. So that's what she's got to fight against. And now this is we'll say the crucial point, right? Before I explain this to you, and I kind of previewed the idea, and now this is really where I get into it. So you have Anne Hathaway, right? You have Catwoman. She's the nihilistic, the person who must overcome nihilism, right? And then you have nihilism itself, right? And nihilism itself is represented by Talia al Ghul. And, well, that's the idea there, right? So whenever Anne Hathaway, right, she has path A, we could say is nihilism. Path B is something like the leap of faith, something like trust, something like humanity itself, positive relationships, like getting into a positive relationship and trusting the other person. And, well, that's a good idea. Like, just because you're in a relationship doesn't mean that you've taken the leap of faith. Doesn't mean that you actually trust the other person. And so this is really what that means. So when Anna Hathaway fights Talia al Ghul, it's really just a simple representation of, okay, she's fighting off her nihilism. And, well, when Talia al Ghul dies, so does Anne Hathaway's nihilism as well as Batman's nihilism, because, well, we could say that Anne Hathaway is a part of. It's the image, it's the projected image that Batman has upon his woman, you could say, his feminine part of himself. And also, what ends up happening is Batman fights Bane, right? Let's see if I have time for this. Yeah, we definitely have time. So maybe I could get to the end of this. We'll see. So Batman fights Bane, and obviously he wins, right? We've gone through the hero-villain idea many times, but that's exactly what it means, right? He says, okay, I'm going to, well, first of all, come back to my city, make the arbitrary moral judgment that I'm going to save the people that are corrupt and flawed and sometimes even fight against me, but no matter what, I'm going to do that. And he beats Bane. And, you have also, like, the entire police, you have the police force coming at him. This is the police force versus the we'll say well, people who fight for their naked self-interest. That's probably a good representation of that, and therefore Batman killing Bane is him fighting against naked self-interest. And there's another archetype here that I think is really, well, it really brings together these important ideas. It brings together the idea itself here of truth, right? What do we mean when we say truth? And it seems like here the answer is something like consciousness, roughly speaking, right? Like being aware and paying attention, these sort of things, they are the bringer of truth, right? They are the people who are going to, or they are the, let's say, spirits, or they are the part of you that's going to open it up, right? You have something like the police force. Really, they're the representation of order, right? They're the ones who try to stabilize this society, going against the representations of chaos. And these are the people who just say, screw society. And, well, the answer is something like the default position, right? Let's bring it back to the basic idea. The default position in life is to ignore the truth, right? Because, well, why would you want to face the truth anyways? The truth is hard. The truth is not easy. It's not an easy thing to face, you know? Order itself is not an easy thing to face. We decide to kind of establish these societies, right? These communities. And the unfortunate reality is they naturally will die, right? They naturally will die. Rome died, right? Unfortunately, America is the oldest democracy in the world, and it's only like 250 years old. It's like things die, and, well, you could say that chaos is the cause of that. Something very, very simple, and, you know, Freud described it as the death instinct. We have an instinct just to kind of destroy everything, but and we could say maybe that's represented in these people, but the idea here is that you must overcome this natural desire to, let's say, reject the truth, because that's really what it is, right? A natural desire to, let's say, you know, a truth comes up and you realize maybe I'm completely inadequate in relationships, right? You say maybe I'm not a good friend. You come to this conclusion, and maybe there's good evidence to support that. Maybe you actually are. Maybe you actually have problems with friends, right? Like that could be a possibility. And, well, you come to this conclusion, or it's so much easier to fend off that conclusion. It's so much easier to say, no, don't really worry about it. I don't really care, than to actually go and find the truth, to go and find the problems. And this is something you see with the people, well, that's the fundamental idea. The people who don't want to help themselves, they say don't help the people who don't want to help themselves, and the reason why is because they're lying to themselves. Oftentimes, you know, they're lying to themselves, and they're saying, wait a second, why do I need to recognize this unfortunate truth and go on the path that's required of me? It's like, okay, let's say you're overeating, right? And you're eating too much food and you're gaining weight. It's so much easier to say, well, no, I'm not gaining weight, or just simply not to notice it. And by doing that, what you're saying, not only are you avoiding the unfortunate realization that you're gaining weight, you're also avoiding the unfortunate realization that you need to do things that will make you stop gaining weight. And why would you want to do that? One of the things that I've seen that's really, really weird, it's really, really weird, is that for people who gain weight, and I've seen this in younger people as well as older, I've seen it often, is that it takes them a very long time to realize that they've gained weight. Like, I don't want to give a specific example, but it's like, okay, so you gain 20, 30 pounds, and you only realize that you've gained weight after you've gained 30 pounds. It's like, maybe you know as you're going along, maybe you kind of understand it, but it all hits you at once, and this is what I've noticed, it hits you at once, and you're like, wait a second, I am 30 pounds heavier than I thought I was, or than I used to be, and it's something like you've been lying to yourself the whole time. And this is another thing, getting back to relationships, you see this in marriages too. You see this, it's a misconception that the first year of marriage is the best. It's like, oh yes, you establish your new home, you establish, your new relationships, all of these things are happening and things are going really well. Something like a honeymoon phase, things are going incredible. Actually, statistically, the first year of marriage is the hardest. Always. The first year of marriage is the hardest. And the question is why? And it's because you imagine that there's something like the default relationship, right? The default relationship is something like, I don't trust you, you don't trust me, and we just sort of live together, right? Because why would I want to open up to you, and why would you want to open up to me? And the unfortunate reality is, if this is really a true marriage, right, I've never opened up as much as I'm supposed to open up to you, because I'm supposed to give all of myself to you. And well, that's what you do. In the first year of marriage, what you end up doing is you unveil the truths, you unveil we'll say the hidden parts of yourself at will. You just keep going, right? And both people do this, and both people must sort of grapple with this idea, wait a second, this is real, and, well, I must, we'll say, embrace the truth. I must embrace the true person that I'm married. There's no more illusions. There's no more projections. It's more of like, okay, now I'm getting to marry the real you, and you're getting to marry the real me. And also, right, another reason why it's really difficult is something like relationships, right? In the first year, when you establish your relationship, it's like there's a power dynamic there. There's a really, really strong power dynamic, especially between men and women, because you're thinking, okay, how are we going to sort this out, right? How are we going to sort this out? This is not an easy thing, and there are many things that have to go on with that. And, well, you sort all of that out in your first year of marriage, right? You must figure out there are two things that could happen. Either one partner lays down and dies and just says, I'm just going to let the other person have all the power. And we could say that's not pursuing your truth because, well, you're just giving your authority to the other person. Or if both people are strong enough, and that's what should happen, both people are strong enough, they both fight for their rights. They both fight for their truth. They both fight for their own self-interest, because if not, then, well, good luck in a marriage. Good luck for the rest of your life being in a place where you gave up the power, where you gave up your own self-interest, and of course that's going to lead you to be very, very resentful. So that's the idea here. The idea here is to raise truth, to we'll say, to bring up the truth from the default position, right? From the default position, it requires all of your consciousness. It requires every single thing that you got. It requires your entire police force, right? It requires everything because, well, if you don't, then you stagnate and die and do it. Well, exactly what Batman was in the beginning of this. So, we got that. And that is much of it. So we have, Talia al Ghul stabs him, right? Reveals herself as essentially the negative anima, right? The resentful, nihilistic part of him that, remember, Batman was exactly like in the beginning of the movie, where he says, there's nothing out there for me, right? He's giving this nihilistic answer of, well, I don't trust relationships. I don't care about relationships anymore. So, essentially, he fights that off, right? And there's this idea that, like he was in a relationship with her, with Talia, right? So this idea is something like relationships are deceiving, and that you are very likely to be deceived by, well, your anima, right? Or in this case, something like people, right? You're very likely to be betrayed, deceived, used as a tool by people, but you're supposed to overcome that. And who's the person to overcome that? It's Anne Hathaway, right? It's Catwoman, and Catwoman comes to save the day, and you have that idea, and then they get together, right? Very, very simple idea. So what we've really been tracking throughout this entire time is the development of Batman's anima, and this is why I say this is a love story. This is why I made this initial proposition. It's something like, well, in the beginning, right? In the beginning of the movie, Batman's anima was locked up in Rachel, right? It was stuck in Rachel. It was stuck in his past relationships. We could say it was something resembling trust issues, if you want to take the archetype and bring it down. And all it needed was something like, well, a clean slate, right? A clean slate, something to sort of open it up, but it was locked up, right? That's the problem. It was completely locked up. And, well, it was represented by someone who is incredibly nihilistic and mirrored Batman's exact ideology. And what he had to do was go down into the depths, right? He had to go down into the lowest amount of depths, something like getting betrayed, first of all, and then climbing his way out of it, taking this arbitrary leap of trust, right? He had trust issues, and now he's going to take the arbitrary leap of trust, which, again, is flawed, but he's going to do it anyways. And that action itself is the thing that opens up the anima, right? That action itself is the thing that opens up your relationships in general, because, and in his case, the relationship with women, because, well, there is no relationships without trust. And Batman says, I am willing, he comes to this conclusion, I am willing to come to, through the most rigorous amount of suffering to achieve this sort of goal, but I'm willing to go through the suffering to, well, achieve truth, right? I'm going to keep my principles. I'm going to keep this idea of trust, and I'm going to go through as much suffering possible to keep this life within me, to keep this idea of trust, this principle of trust within my relationships. And that's something that we do in society all the time. Like, there's this idea that you must never negotiate with terrorists, right? This is a strong American ideal, and we agree this is a pretty good idea. And the answer is something simple, like, well, you could break that principle. You could break that idea once. You can negotiate with a person once, because when you negotiate for the first time, right? Let's say someone has hostages, and you decide that you are going to negotiate and say, okay, $100,000 per hostage, right? Well, what happens is now they're going to start getting more hostages, right? Because now they have an incentive, and then you're going to have to start, now it's a runaway cycle. So the idea here is something like, no matter how much suffering these terrorists are giving me, no matter how many hostages they're taking, I'm going to uphold my principles. I'm going to go through the ultimate amount of suffering to, well, achieve the end goal. So, let's see if we have... I'm going to keep going, but my camera's probably going to die. All right, so we'll keep going. So the idea here is very simple, right? So now Batman is killed off. He's killed off the Bane, which is the representation of mistrust in the male form, we could say, masculine form. And then he's also killed off Talia Ghul, which is the representation of nihilism, the negative form. And both of them are nihilism. Both of them are teamed up together, right? We find out that they're essentially a pair. And, well, what does he do, right? What must happen now in the typical hero's journey framework? He must die, right? He must die. Batman must die. And the idea here is very, very simple. It's like this is killing off the nihilism within him. He is no longer nihilist. So he dies, but it's a fake death. We have this entire, it's the nuclear bomb, saves the city, all that good stuff. And the idea here is simple, right? Like there's always the idea that it's a fake death is not a new idea. There's always the idea of death and resurrection. It's just a matter of how they wanted to do that, In a fairy tale, for example, you're going to have someone actually die and then, something like the magical spirit wakes them up. You see that in Beauty and the Beast, Tangled, Sleeping Beauty, right? Like what is the thing that wakes up Sleeping Beauty? It's the same idea. So the fact, in the manner in which he dies doesn't really matter. It's just the fact that he dies and therefore he's going to resurrect as a new person. And we're going to see that. But first we got to figure out, okay, what exactly in him was the thing that died. So first of all, we have the fact that it is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known, right? So simply what he's saying there is, I'm going to be in a better place, right? And I'm going to be in a better place, not because he's literally dying, not because he's literally moving on to heaven, he's just moving on to the next part of his life. So that's a good representation. So when we say Batman is dying, that's a good point. When we say Batman is dying, it's not that he's literally dying, it's just that he's done being a hero, right? He's done doing the hero things. And, well, you'll see that sometime in your own life, right? You'll see that. It's like, by the time that we could say that by the time that you're 30 to 35, you're either really pursuing things or you're just you've kind of tapered off and you're like, I don't really want to keep pursuing things and I'm just going to sort of stagnate at my job, which is essentially the death of the hero. Or you have a kid, right? And when you have a kid, or maybe even a marital relationship, I don't know about that one, but whenever you have a kid, it's like you are not a person anymore. It's like you are a person who's living within them. You are living through them, and you're not a hero anymore. They're the hero. They are the we'll say, they're the hero, and you have died, and now your goal is just to sort of support their heroic nature. That's it. So at one point, and this is why I really like the death of a hero, because we really don't see that often. Usually you see at the end of the movie there's a hero who's triumphant and everything's good and everything's happening. But this idea of the death of a hero is really, really strong. So eventually the hero must die. And so what does this also leave? This leaves Alfred, right? And Alfred is a simple representation of morals, right? He's the conscience. Remember, he's the conscience, and we've played that out throughout all of the Dark Knight trilogy. He's the representation of the conscience. And what does that mean? He has his old morals, right? His old morals have died, right? He's got to give up his old morals and establish new morals because he's going to be almost a new person. When you decide to be, for example, when you go from being a bachelor to being a father, right, or a single lady to being a mother, right, you're literally a completely new person. And the morals in which held up one part of you is going to be a completely different new set of morals. So you get rid of the morals, right? Then you also have, he gets a statue named after him, which is essentially, well, he achieved his goal, right? He made it to the end, and because he's the ideal hero, he achieved his goal. He did the things that he wanted to do. And now let's get into the great, really, really great representation that they did here. So what happened is, right, he becomes rebirthed, right? He's rebirthed, and they do it so well. They do it so well, where Alfred sees him at the, sort of has a reunion with him in I forget where it was, someplace in, I think it was Venice, right? Someplace in Italy, and he's living a new life, right? He's living a new life in a new relationship, and he has, well, transcended his old nihilistic Batman past. And Well, that's pretty beautiful right there. And then let's see what else. I mean, then there's one final idea. One final idea is just finally at the end, right? I brought up this archetype completely throughout the series, but I brought this up in the beginning. The idea is something like Batman integrated his father within him because, well, his father died off, and by the time that his father died off, he keeps the lessons within him, and therefore the symbolic aspect of his father dying is the integration of his father within him. And for example, right, this is exactly what you do when you read a book, right, or you watch this lecture series. It's like you take the book itself and the lessons from the book, and hopefully you're not going to be reading that same book every single day. You put down the book and the lessons are within you. And the same idea goes with hopefully this lecture series, right? You're not going to have to keep watching this lecture series. It's like the lessons go within you. And so this is what Batman does, right? So he fixed the autopilot on the machine, and essentially he did the thing that Fox could not do, right? And since he did the thing that Lucius Fox could not do, he's integrated Lucius Fox. That's the representation. Then he gives the house to Alfred, right? And when he gives the house to Alfred, he's integrated his conscience, right? Or at least you could say, yes, he's integrated his conscience into, we'll say, the moral structure, right? So he said, I'm giving the house to Alfred, and I'm going to essentially preserve my morals. I'm going to leave my morals here with the city because, well, that's what you should do. And then you have the same thing with Gordon, right, where you sort of have he essentially integrated optimism, right? Gordon is the representation of optimism, and he integrates that really well, and that's the representation of the bat symbol coming together, right? They put the bat symbol together, and that means that there's always hope. There's always hope, and so there's the integration there, and then he finally integrates with this child character, and I haven't really got into who he is, but he's essentially the child hero. He's essentially the mentee, but also the child hero, and he integrates with him by giving up his home to the city's at-risk children. So you kind of have the integration there, and that's something like, well, the next idea, and this is the final scene in the movie where he gives his powers to the next generation. He gives it to the child hero, and he says, well, I'm passing the buck to you, right? I'm passing the buck to you. You are the next generation. Because I have died as a hero, I'm giving it off to you. You are going to be, well, the new hero. You're going to be the new hero. And he's represented here as Robin. And, well, I guess that's my final lesson to take from this. And it's a very, very simple idea. It's like we listen to all these heroes all the time, right? There are all these hero movies that we always watch, and we always admire them as someone that is greater than us. And, well, my recommendation here is just to be something like Robin, right? If you take anything from this entire lecture series, from the entire thing, well, Batman is you, right? Batman is you. Do not think that you are just watching this movie. Take it as something that you can act upon and be a hero in your own life. And, well, I know that you've already seen my book, but I give you the steps to do this in my book. You don't have to do this with my book, but there are many ways that you can do this, and the idea is very simple. Take the lessons that you learned here and apply them in the world. That's it. Something like The smallest act of kindness is better than the grandest intention. Take the lessons that you learned here and apply them via action in the world, and apply them to your habits, apply them to yourself, apply them to your relationships, every single thing that you could be a hero in, apply it to. And, well, if you don't, then you miss the entire point of this lecture series. But thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.